All right. Welcome, everybody. I don't see anybody here, so I'm sure people start pouring in. And how y'all doing? So I'm finally get to doing a review. I haven't done one in a little bit. And as I've said many times before, the goal here is to review every single video on metaethics on the entire internet. And it's hard to keep up because new videos come out. And this one came out just a few days ago. It's a conversation between Miles Donahue and David Enoch, who has been a guest on the channel. I thought we had a great conversation. I know a few people have asked me if David Enoch and I will have another one. I can reach out to him and see if he wants to have another talk. I don't know if there's something new for us to go over. That conversation was a little more debatey. And so what might make sense is for me to ask him if he'd like to come on and just talk about the case that he makes for moral realism, and in particular, one of his distinctive arguments, which is deliberative indispensability. It would be cool to just focus on that. And instead of having it be like argumentative, have it be more just, hey, what's your perspective on this? Why do you endorse this view? I think that'd be a cool way to do things. Anyway, what's up, Andrew Moy? You're going to get 1,000 Lancelot Goblin Lord. You get 500, and we'll see who else shows up. But let's get started with the video. And this one, what I decided to do for this one is not watch it in advance. So I haven't heard a word of this. I don't know what's going to happen. I did look at the comments, so I have some sense of what might be in the video, but we'll just get started. I'm not getting bombarded with questions immediately like I did last. Okay, I already got one. Okay, cool. We got Maya here, and you get 250 Lancelot. Hello. If there's a place I can message you, I saw a debate that got into some medical stuff. Yeah, so great. Thank you for that, for wanting to get in touch with me about something. Let me show you where to get in touch with me. So if you go to my channel page, if you go over to, where is it at? Oh, just the channel page itself, which I'll just post here. Hudson, yes, you're too late for Lancelot. You just missed it. You're the fourth person, and I give it to the first three. So if you go there and then you go to the description where it says more, you'll see a bunch of stuff. And that also includes my email address, and you could just email me directly. And that should be a way of getting in touch with me. If you don't hear from me, you could send another email, or you could message me. I don't know. Try the email, I guess, but it might hit the spam folder. I usually check that, so give it a shot. All right. That's tragic. Yeah, it's extremely tragic. You got to be here. You ready to go. I haven't been scheduling them. I used to schedule these back a couple years ago, and now life is a little more hectic. So I do them when there's like a little gap in time here and there. So, all right, let's get going on the video. Should be all set up. Okay. Let's fiddle around with this. Yeah, I like that better. I like that format better. Okay, let's do it.
The title of your PhD thesis was A Defense of Robust Metanormative Realism. So if you could break that down for us piece by piece, what is robust about this? What does metanormative mean? And why is this a realism? What is this metaethical view?
Okay, so let's start with the metanormative stuff. So I think of the moral or ethical or both as a particular instance of the normative. So that there's more to the normative than just the moral properties, moral facts. They are paradigmatic normative facts and properties, but there are also others, perhaps some epistemic facts, perhaps some prudential facts, perhaps there are others as well. So the normative is just a superset of the ethical. And because realism, which I'll get to in a second, is an existentially quantified thesis, right? So this is about there being such properties and facts, then a metanormative realism is strictly weaker than a metaethical one. So strictly speaking, I'm only insisting on there being some normative facts and properties remaining officially neutral on whether any of them are also moral. You can.
Okay, so yeah, it's perfectly good characterization, about metanormativity, and that's how I view it as well. So often I use the term domain to talk about different sort of normative, you call them normative domains. So one domain would be the moral domain. You could kind of think of these almost like you would think of like the taxonomy of organisms, where the broader set is normativity, and then within that there's going to be subcategories, and moral norms would be one of them. And so what he is saying, argues for, is metanormative realism, which would be realism about at least some normative facts in some domain or other, which may or may not turn out to be moral facts. So there could be, it could be just epistemic facts, it could be prudential facts, it could be aesthetic facts. So you can imagine there being a variety of normative domains. I would be curious if David Enoch believes that there are normative domains that are constructivistic or clearly stance dependent. I don't know what he thinks about aesthetics, but there's got to be norms of like that are constructed by people. Like, I'm trying to think, the rules we use to like judge divers or something like that, or figure skaters. Maybe those have a constructive quality to them that's stance dependent. But of course, that would be completely consistent with being a realist. All you have to do is be a realist about literally one norm, and boom, you're a realist. But I am curious what he would think is pretty uncontroversially like an anti-realist position, like which normative domains he would be an anti-realist about. Anyway, I just wanted to say something about this. I don't like the videos to go too long without me commenting, since the purpose of this is to comment, not to just sit here and watch a video with you all. Andrew Moy says, is the video volume a bit low for anyone else? I have it on maximum, as you saw. I went and checked when you said that, and it is on maximum. So I can turn up the volume for myself, but I can't change it for you. And so if their volume is low and my volume's higher, there's not a whole lot I could do. Like maybe I could turn the gain down and then you turn the volume up on. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, so that might help a little bit. Yeah, and then there's going to be like social conventions of various kinds. So Hudson says, would politeness manners be another example of constructed normativity? I think so, because if we're talking like table etiquette, like where you place a fork, it would be really strange to think that there is a stance independent fact of the matter about that. All right, let's keep going.
I believe that there are normative facts, but that actually the subset of them, which constitutes the moral fact, is actually an empty subset. So that's why it's metanormative. As it happens, I also think that once you're willing to go realist on the normative, refusing to go realist on the ethical becomes just undermotivated. So I think it supports the more narrowly metaethical realism, but it doesn't entail it. It supports it. So much for the metanormative part of that.
So I'm actually not convinced of that, but it typically when people present things like companions and guilt arguments, and they say something like, look, the kinds of motivations or reasons you would have for for rejecting moral realism would also be applicable to non-moral domains like epistemic norms. So if you want to be an anti-realist about morality on pain of inconsistency, you'd have to be an anti-realist about these other domains. And if a person doesn't want to be, then they're in a state of reflective disequilibrium. In order to get into a state where they have consistent views, they would have to either embrace moral realism or reject realism in whatever other domain is tethered to it. Now, typically, I just accept parity premises, which are any premise where you're sort of tying the case for moral realism to the case for another normative domain, such that to reject the reasons you would have for rejecting moral norms would be equally or approximately equally applicable to that other domain. So it's got to be both or neither. You have to accept both or reject both. So the idea there is if you don't want to reject the other ones, then look, you got to accept the moral norms. You got to accept moral realism. So typically I've just said, yeah, for the sake of argument, I'll just accept there's parity and I reject norms in those other domains. So I have basically the opposite view of David Enoch, which is you could call me a metanormative anti-realist or a global normative anti-realist, which means that I reject the notion that there are stance independent normative facts in any domain. So it's sort of a non-issue for me to say that the motivations for one of these positions would be applicable to the others. So if you embrace non-moral normative realism, you might as well embrace moral realism on pain of some sort of inconsistency or having an unmotivated distinction between the two. Not an issue for me, but I do think that there is a way in which you could critique specifically the notion of realism about the moral domain. And the way in which you would do that would be a little roundabout. It would be to argue something like that the moral domain is culturally constructed and that there are no principled or distinctive characteristics. You could say a nomological cluster or something like that of characteristics that distinguish moral norms, characteristically moral norms from non-moral norms. That's a complicated way of saying, well, you don't have to be a realist about moral norms because there is no moral domain to be a realist about in the first place. That I think is a tough argument to make, but I do think that the argument could be made and that it is a position I'm sympathetic to. And so in that case, if there is no moral domain, then you could be a realist about social norms or cooperative norms or pro-social norms or epistemic norms or whatever else you might be a realist about, and then deny moral realism on the grounds that there really isn't any distinctive domain of morality in the first place. And again, I wouldn't say I'm sympathetic. I actually tactically endorse that position, but I think it's very difficult to argue for that position, so I don't tend to do so. But there is a paper on this by Stephen Stitch called The Moral Domain. And what he argues is, look, efforts by psychologists and philosophers to offer some principal distinction between moral and non-moral norms haven't been successful so far. And so inference to the best explanation would be that the reason why none of them have been successful so far is that there isn't a moral domain. Edward Mashery, in the same volume, this is the Atlas of Moral Psychology I mentioned a few times on the channel. Editor's Kurt Gray, if you want to look it up. Edward Mashery has a paper there called Morality, a Historical Invention. And what he argues is that the disposition to draw a distinction between moral and non-moral norms is a kind of culturally contingent and learned capacity. And that growing empirical evidence suggests that when you ask people outside, I don't know exactly how he characterizes it in the paper, but you could say something roughly like weird cultures. When you look at how people outside of those cultures distinguish norms from one another, the categorization schemes that they use don't match Western conceptions or weird conceptions of moral versus non-moral. And so it doesn't really look like people are psychologically innately predisposed to carve up the normative space in terms of a moral, non-moral distinction. So, and instead, the origins of this distinction actually have their roots in contingent features of the history of certain human cultures. So I think that's right. I actually don't think thinking in moral terms is a cultural universal. And so I actually do think there is a way to resist the idea that if you accept realism in some other normative domain, that you ought to accept it in the moral domain, because I think that there's something that's asymmetrically applicable to moral normativity as opposed to these other potential normative domains. In other words, there's like a symmetry breaker there. There actually is a difference. Okay. Faith because of reason. You're too late. You're too late. I can't give a special treatment. Femboy Origami says, I remember I'm hinting at supporting aesthetic realism in your discussion together. I don't remember that. You remember my discussion better than I do. Jagged says, I cannot understand a single word he's saying. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot I can do about that. I turned the gain down on my mic. I hope that equalizes the volume a bit if you turn it up. But yeah, in addition to the volume being a little low on his end, the sound quality is also not good. I'm not seeing a mic in front of him, so there's a good chance he's using like a webcam mic or something. He's got to get a better mic. So, and I spoke with my guest yesterday, and I know that we had some audio problems there as well. And I know if you all noticed, we switched halfway through. He was using the wrong mic input. So audio problems are a problem here. I hope you could all get through this with me. I'm not having a ton of trouble hearing it. So, hopefully you can make some volume adjustments on your end. Anyway, let's keep going.
What is now apparent, clearly not the most attractive of titles. Realism is roughly the view realism say about, but for now let's talk as if we're doing metaethics and not metanormativity. We can go back to metanormativity later on. So metaethical realism is roughly the view that there are moral facts, there are moral properties, that when we are that our moral discourse, at least when successful, captures them. It's about these moral facts and properties. So you are one way of rejecting realism is to deny that moral discourse is even in the business of describing the moral parts of the universe. And it's not about capturing facts, it's about voicing emotions, say, or something along these lines. So that's one way of rejecting realism. You're a realist if you think that moral discourse is very much in the business of being true or false, stating facts. And so another way, paradigmatic way of rejecting realism.
Just a note on that. Wouldn't it be a bit weird if moral discourse wasn't about like trying to describe stance-independent moral facts? Why couldn't that mean that there were still stance-independent moral facts? there seems to be some sort of link between the way we happen to speak and some sort of metaphysical truths. And something about that strikes me as a bit odd. I don't know what he would say about the relation between the two, and maybe he'll say more about it. But if we convinced everybody to stop, like, let's say we convinced everybody to be emotivists, and they all started using moral language to only express their emotional attitudes, would philosophers that endorse a sort of semantic thesis according to which moral language describes or purports to describe stance-independent moral facts, would they say that people are no longer engaged in moral discourse at that point? Like, again, imagine 100% of people are now emotivists, right? They're committed to emotivism. That's what they take themselves to mean. Would we say that they actually are purporting to describe stance-independent moral facts, and they're all just, their communicative intent is just not aligned with the meaning of the sentences, so the sentences have a meaning independent of communicative intent? Or would they say they're not engaged in moral discourse? Or would they at that point go, well, hold up, there's moral facts, whether they're moral facts or not, just doesn't depend on what people mean when they say things. I don't know what David would say to that. I'd be curious to ask. Maybe he already answered that question when we talked, because apparently I can't remember. Yeah, Moxie says the metaphysical truths are supposed to explain features of our discourse, I guess. Right, but what if you think that the discourse is actually committed to some other metaethical position? Does that mean you can't be a realist?
Is to think that even though the discourse is in the business of achieving truth, it never succeeds in doing that. So that's the kind of view that many of us have to say about astrology. We don't think that astrological discourse is merely about emoting. We think it's about stating some factual claims, except they are all systematically false, or anyway, none of them is true. There's some error that is just runs through the entire astrological discourse. So one can have a similar view about morality. We think, sure, it attempts to describe the moral parts of the universe, but there are no such parts of the universe.
Yes.
Moral discourse is ridden with systematic
Right. So
error.
this is Matt Lutz and others' moral error theory.
Right. So I think the name who's most commonly associated with that moral error theory is J.L. Mackie, but there are many others who have followed suit in different ways, obviously. Right. So the most minimal kind of realism is just the denial of these two ways of rejecting it. Namely, moral claims are in the business of being true or false. They are factual claims. They are at least attempts at describing the moral parts of the universe. And second, at least sometimes they succeed. So it's not as if they are ridden with systematic error. But that's probably not enough. Another thing that people often associate with realism, as do I, is the thought that there, at least in a sense, moral facts are objective. Now, this in a sense bit is important because there are different ways of thinking about this, but let's go again in the opposite direction. Suppose you think that all it takes for an action to be wrong is for it to be such that the powerful hate it. Well, if that's your view, then in at least intuitive sense, you're not a realist. It's not as if you're not an error theorist, because the powerful certainly hate a few things. Right? And this descriptive or something along these lines, but it is way too strongly dependent on us and our responses. In the case of the toy example that I gave, the responses of some of us, right? The powerful. So in order to be a realist, it seems like you have to believe that moral facts, moral properties are, at least to an extent, response independent, perspective independent. They don't depend on our will. They are such that when we are successful in our moral inquiries, we discover rather than create or construct or legislate or anything along these lines. So these.
I will note, he just say construct or legislate, but it's also possible for you to think that the moral facts are an extension of attitudes or preferences that you can't voluntarily design or construct or devise. He just agree with that. But sometimes people frame realism in terms of there being a distinction between discovering versus like creating. And I don't really like that distinction, because it's like, let's say you think moral facts express your personal moral values, but you think that moral values are a matter of like self-discovery. Take food preferences. Don't you discover what foods you like as you get older. Children find out which foods they like, and it's not up to them. They don't choose. Like if I could just choose what I liked, I would just hate cake and love super healthy food. It's not up to me. So I do think that this framing ought to be largely abandoned when describing anti-realist positions, because I think it's just simply inaccurate.
The three tenets of what at least I would call realism, but again, everything is controversial, including how we use the term, has to be fact-stating, error theory has to be rejected, and it can't be too subjective. Some moral realists, many moral realists, are metaphysical naturalists. So they think roughly that the ultimate list of the things that exist comes from the natural sciences. The only thing, I mean, not today's natural sciences, because there's still some work to be done, but that's pretty much it. Or the kind of things that exist are the kind of things that the natural sciences study. And that's it, crucially, and that's it. If that's what you think, but you also want to be a realist, so you don't want to, as it were, throw moral facts out of your ontology. What you need to do is to give an account of moral facts as themselves being, at the end of the day, a natural fact. And some people do that, and some people do that while satisfying the sort of three conditions that I started with. So they will be, they can be called naturalist realists. When I say that I'm a robust realist, really what I mean is mostly that I'm not a naturalist. So I believe that the moral part of the universe, as it were, is radically different from the natural parts of the universe.
I wonder why that should be called robust. What's more robust about non-naturalist realism as opposed to naturalist realism? I don't know. There's something potentially. I don't know that naturalists would think that their realist accounts are less robust. Like they just think they're qualitatively different in some ways. Not that I haven't said before that I think that non-naturalist realism that has more stuff. Like naturalism seems to give some concessions to what at least some realists want out of morality.
Moral facts are of a different kind than the kind of facts that we study in our successful natural sciences.
What are some examples of moral realist naturalism? Some views, like what would they say moral properties are? What would they say moral reality is that would be amenable to scientific investigation?
Right. So obviously different realists will have different views, right? But a toy example that's often given is at least a version of utilitarianism. So you may think that for an action to be right, just is for it to be such that there's no alternative with better consequences in terms of utility, right? Be it pleasure over pain or happiness over suffering or something along these lines. If you think not just that actions are permissible if and only if they maximize utility, but that's what it is for an action to be permissible. It's for it to be such that it maximizes utility. If you go for this identity claim, notice that on one side you have a normative and a moral claim, what is for an action to be morally permissible, right? But on the other side, what you have is a natural property. Maximizing utility is, well, hard to study, not impossible to study naturalistically, right? It's pretty much a complicated psychological fact, but a psychological fact nonetheless. So that would be a naturalist realist view. There could be others, as long as you go for this kind of an identity claim.
So that's interesting to me. I've always wondered about the relationship between these normative theories like utilitarianism and metaethics. And so what you're saying, I take it, is that you don't have to be a utilitarian and a moral naturalist, but you can be if you think that central claim that maximizes, say, a simplistic version like pleasure over pain. If you think that's an identity claim, that for something to be morally obligatory just is for it to maximize pleasure over pain, then you're a moral naturalist. But you don't have to be. You could still be a utilitarian in that simple form and say this is a fundamental normative claim that the right thing to do is to maximize pleasure over pain. But
just not much to comment on here. Matthias asks about fine-tuning. I don't really have a position on it. I mean, I don't accept any particular arguments for the existence of God, so I'm not going to buy the argument, but I just haven't studied the topics enough to have a settled or particularly well-informed position on the matter.
Now I'm a bit confused. How would you avoid the identity? What would it be to be a utilitarian without that identity?
Well, you would have to say something. You would still want you would still want there to be a very close connection between the property of being morally permissible and the property of being utility maximizing. But you would want to avoid the identity claim. So you would have to rely on some other kind of relation. Here's one possibility. You may think, for instance, that the natural property grounds the normative one. But we know that grounding is not identity. It actually does capture an intuitive feature, right? So grounding is anti-symmetric in a way that identity is not. Identity is obviously symmetrical, right? So you may want to say, look, some actions are permissible in virtue of being utility maximizing. But I don't think it's true that some actions are utility maximizing in virtue of being permissible. So there's some strong intuitive pressure not to go for an identity claim, or at least not to go for only an identity claim, to go for a more complicated view that incorporates something by way of asymmetry. It's actually...
I want them to get to the juicy stuff. I'm thinking I should skip this section. So, because I just don't really have anything to say on the distinction. Let's see. They go on about it for like 7 or 8 minutes. Let's skip ahead. All right.
So my concern primarily is not with the distinction between like cognitivists and non-cognitivists, the question of like, what do people intend to do with their moral language? Do they intend to express facts, moral facts, or do they intend to do something else? Are they just expressing emotion, for example? Rather, I want to ask about why we shouldn't be moral error theorists. For me, for whatever that's worth, the most plausible views on the table would be moral error theory or a robust moral realism. So what reasons motivate you in affirming robust moral realism over just saying, yeah, these are the intentions of our moral language, but all of our moral claims are just false?
I find it interesting someone would think error theory and robust realism are the most viable positions on the table. I could see someone not being inclined towards naturalism, but I'm puzzled as to why someone would not think that something like relativism or constructivism would be more plausible than one or the other of those two positions. If you think that the question of the meaning of moral claims is pretty much settled, then I could see that. But I don't think that it is. And I also would just find it a bit strange to hinge so much of your metaethical stance on what you take ordinary moral discourse to be about. Yeah, someone mentions relativism. Like personally, you know, I don't accept error theory. But I don't think something like it's got to be either my anti-realist view or non-naturalist realism. If I rejected my particular anti-realist view, I would probably embrace some type of subjectivism, and if not that, some type of expressivism or something. It's very unlikely I would accept error theory. I think that's these days. I think it's probably the least likely of the three main anti-realist positions, which are expressivism, relativism, or really stance-dependent cognitivist accounts. If we're being more specific, I haven't seen anybody else use that terminology, but that's what they should use. Or error theory. I think error theory is the least plausible because I just think that we have pretty good reason to not think most people speak or think like realists. And insofar as the position is predicated on the semantic thesis being that ordinary moral claims purport to describe stance-dependent moral facts, I think as an empirical matter, that's probably not true. And so I think error theory, to a certain extent, has been falsified as a or if not falsified, then I think the preponderance of evidence is presently against it as a description of like the typical way that people speak or think. Now, of course, you could always be a conditional error theorist, conditional on you using moral language to mean X. Then if there is no X, then I'm an error theorist about that discourse. Because I don't think everybody has to use moral language to mean the same things. So you could call me a sometimes error theorist. So if some people use moral language to describe what they take to be natural moral facts, and I don't think that those are the natural moral facts, maybe I'd be an error theorist about that. Although in that case, it's unlikely. Well, I might not think that certain kinds of moral facts like supervene on the natural facts. I might think there are the natural facts, but not the moral facts. So I might be an error theorist in that case. If there's some sort of like really reductive naturalist, then I might just think, yeah, there are facts of that kind, but I don't think you're telling me much if you call them moral facts. So it's really going to depend on the type of error theory, or sorry, the type of naturalism.
Why would you not agree with that?
Yeah, so let's definitely get into this, but can I first say something about, as it were, the methodology here? Okay. because you express the kind of sympathies of a more of a philosophical extremist. I'm going to be well, I think I'm going to be rephrasing you. If not, please correct me. But you're saying something like, look, I know what I want when I do ethics. What I want is the whole thing. These moral facts, they don't depend on us in any way, fully objective, necessary, whatever. I don't know, maybe you even want them to be causally efficacious, something along these lines. And if I don't get that, then error theory. If I do get that, if the universe cooperates, then robust realism, right? But these are the only two options. The job description of moral facts, that job description is set, and either the universe satisfies it or it does not, which is another way of saying either robust moral realism or error theory.
And is this somehow set by the meaning of ordinary moral discourse? And if so, is the meaning of ordinary moral discourse an empirical question? And if so, how has this been settled? Like, we don't know what ordinary people mean when they make moral claims. I know philosophers will appeal to various armchair considerations, but those are either non-empirical, which then I think are inappropriate methods for addressing the question, or they are empirical, but then they're speculative hypotheses. They're not, like, you're not going to figure out tough empirical questions by theorizing from the armchair and like recalling your memory of the way people speak English. That's just not going to fly. So since I don't think that the language questions have really been settled, I find it a bit strange to think that these are the only contenders on the table. Like, what if it turned out we had overwhelming evidence? Like, we went out and we surveyed or interviewed everybody, or we did a bunch of corpus research, and we found out that out of the 7,000 languages in the world, in 5,822 of them, people consistently, reliably use moral language to express their personal preferences. So the majority of languages have a subjectivist semantics. Would we become anti-realist and go, oh, well, then I guess there's no moral facts? Like, or does it require more languages to be that way? Or do they think all languages have some underlying shared feature of whether they do or do not purport to describe stance-independent moral facts? If so, what conceptual language is that? Because that would be a pretty exotic view of language, where all languages are, they have moral discourse, and it's in the business of doing exactly the same thing. So I do think that there's sort of underexplored linguistic questions and potentially empirical questions here that they're kind of moving past or not really addressing in a way I would like to see addressed. You know, of course, people could take a conversation wherever they want. E.S. Lewis from Substack here. I guess an explanation for the error theory versus non-natural realism distinction could be a result of humor style elimination arguments against other anti-realism. Yeah, which I think are really, really, really not effective at all. But the other video I'm going to be reviewing soon is a new humor video where he does the process of elimination thing, which I think is just really not a very good way of approaching this. All right, let's keep going.
Fair enough. Does this capture your kind of intuition here? Okay. I used to think this way too. I even said in the book that I think it's a very interesting question to ask philosophers what your second best view is. So if God whispered in your ear that your view is false, what would be your second best view in the area, right? And I said, well, for me.
So for me, I can answer that question. So if I reject, so currently my position, I would call something like anti-realist quietism. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm a sort of local quietist about a particular type of discourse, which is the descriptive metaethics enterprise. So the descriptive metaethics is a term Michael Gill uses to describe the practice in 20th century metaethics of describing the meaning of ordinary moral claims. Now, when you look at that practice, there's a question about is the goal of that practice an empirical one or not? That's not clear. If it's empirical, then I think the answer is metaethical indeterminacy. So that is, I think that the correct account of what people are doing in moral claims does not determinately favor realism or anti-realism for the most part. So then that would mean if that's the way that we're framing things, then insofar as traditional anti-realist positions all lean on a semantic thesis, error theory says moral language is about describing stance-independent moral facts. Non-cognitivist views say it's about expressing non-propositional states, and relativism, or you could say stance-dependent cognitivist approaches say it's about describing moral facts, cognitivistic. There very well might be facts of the relevant kind, but those facts are dependent on our stances, so you have a type of anti-realism. So that'd be most conventional forms of relativism insofar as they relativize moral standards to stances. It would include constructivism, ideal observer theory, maybe some kinds of crude divine command theory, but probably not the more fancy kinds. So that would include a bunch of stuff. It's not technically relativism as a category. So those would be your standard three. Now, insofar as all three of those rely on a semantic thesis that presupposes what Gill calls uniformity and determinacy, well, if indeterminacy is true, then all of those semantic theses are false. So I can't accept any of the standard positions. So what position do I endorse? Well, I'm an anti-realist. I think there are no stance-independent moral facts, but since I don't have any recognized account of the meaning of ordinary moral discourse on offer with a distinctive label, then I would call myself a quietist insofar as I reject the contemporary discourse and sort of categories on the table as all defective. So the three standard positions are presented as mutually exhaustive, and I think they're not mutually exhaustive. They're all wrong. So that's why I call myself a quietist. Now, if I rejected that, what position would I lean on next? I think it would be some type of individual subjectivism. I think that does a better job than most of the other accounts. And I think what's funny about that is that very well might be, if you asked both realists and anti-realists alike among contemporary meta-ethicists and philosophers more generally, of the anti-realist positions, which is the least plausible? And I think it would be a tough dispute between relativism of some kind and non-cognitivism of some kind. I don't know which would win as the least plausible, whether it would be emotivism or cultural relativism or something, but they're going to be pretty bottom of the barrel. But I actually think that some type of subjectivist view is far more defensible than again, I don't endorse it, but I think it's far closer. So at least when I make moral claims, I'm reporting something about my standards. So I speak like a subjectivist. But if subjectivism is understood to include a semantic thesis where it holds that moral claims make indexed statements about the standards of the individual making the claim, something like that, I don't endorse that because I don't think that's what people are doing when they make moral claims. So it really depends on how you want to describe these views. All right, let's keep going.
My view is robust moral realism, but if God whispered in my ear that robust realism is false, I'd go error theory for something like this line of thought. I'm not sure that's right anymore. Partly the thought experiment of, if God whispered in your ear, etc., is always dangerous. But as one of my teachers told me back then, when I ran this thought experiment on him, it was hard to feel. He thought for a while and he said, I don't know, I think I'd ask God why my view is false. And it makes sense to think that, which view you would go for as the second best may depend on that. Right? But another is a quote I love bringing from David Lewis. I think it's in his paper in Metaethics on dispositional theories of value. And he asks, it's in a context that's it's methodologically similar to the one that we are discussing now. And he talks about how we found out that there's no such thing as absolute simultaneity from Einstein, right? And it says something like, it's not the exact quote, shouted from the rooftops, no such thing as absolute simultaneity. No one whistled while they worked. And that seems like a very powerful reductio, right? But notice that your intuition here, my past self intuition here, is precisely the one being ridiculed. Because you could say, look, when it comes to simultaneity, I know what I want. I want absolute simultaneity. You can talk about simultaneity, I don't know, relative to a frame of reference until the cows come home, but I know what I want. I want the absolute thing. And either the universe cooperates or it doesn't. If it does, all is well. If not, I'll go error theoretic, which means that no one ever whistled while they worked. Right? Whereas Lewis is being much more tolerant, as course. No. Actually, error theory is not a real option here. Of course, people whistle while they work. And if that means that you should revise your job description, now that you know that nothing can do the job of absolute simultaneity, that doesn't mean you need to conclude that no one ever whistled while they work. What you need to conclude is that you never actually cared about absolute simultaneity. You were fine.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with anything he's saying here. I think he's doing a good setup of like the negotiability of one's antecedent commitments, and one could find that while they thought of themselves as regarding a certain type of discourse or a certain conception of things as non-negotiable, that when confronted with a certain kind of reality, it's negotiable, and you were just wrong about what you thought you were committed to. That seems completely reasonable to me. I think that's probably true.
With other things as well, things that are consistent with our best physics. and that's good enough. So that was a very long and sort of roundabout way of saying I'm not sure that the spirit of philosophical extremism is always the way to go. But I still see its appeal, and I'm happy to talk about why we should go robust realist rather than error theoretic. And I definitely have a lot of respect for error theoretical views, at least compared to some of the intermediate views that often seem to me like cheating, like a way of trying to convince you that you've never wanted more to begin with, which is just
well, I haven't wanted more to begin with, so there is that. It's an open question what people want out of these views and what they consider negotiable or not.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a fair corrective that I'll have to think about. I don't know that I have any profound thoughts off the top of my head. I guess just to make a purely descriptive claim about me, an autobiographical claim, is that I feel the threat of moral error theory. I feel its plausibility because it does align so much with convictions I already have. It's just like one step away. We get rid of the claim that our moral claims are true. So it's, in that sense, it's very close to the views I already hold, rather than, so there's a sense in which
I see
they're not really like the two extremes. Rather, they overlap considerably, but of course they differ on one claim, which then has huge implications either way.
It's true that they overlap. Error theory is often presented as the conjunction of two kinds of claim. One is a claim about the commitments of the relevant discourse, and the second is the claim about the universe.
Yeah.
And in particular, showing that the commitments from the first claim are not actually met in the way the world is. And it's an often made point that error theorists and robust moral realists tend to agree on the first part of the error theory.
right.
That's not just true in ethics; it's true elsewhere as well, right? So if you're a Platonist about abstract objects, you believe that numbers and sets and whatever are abstract, objective, and whatever. If you are an error theorist about abstract objects, you agree about the job description. You agree that that's what would have to be the case for abstract objects to exist. But then you say that the universe is such.
Oh, man, they're not getting to any of the juicy stuff that I want to respond to. It's a good video so first of all, he's got to improve that sound quality. He needs a mic. There should be a fund, and I'm not even joking about this, like an actual fund for sending microphones to philosophers so that when they do interviews, they're all higher quality. It'd benefit all of us, literally everybody, for people to have better microphones. I'm in the mediocre, like low end zone where it's like acceptable, but I don't have great audio stuff. Part of it is probably the room. Part of it is I'm probably not using the mic properly. Like, does it sound better if I speak directly into it? I don't know. I don't want to start doing ASMR here. So I could probably get a better sound setup. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, it would be cool to have some sort of fund to get webcams and mics for philosophers that are being interviewed or something. Could someone get that done? I don't have any position to get that done, but it'd be cool. Because like Mike Humer has some interviews where it's really hard to understand him because the sound quality is so bad. Yeah. I don't know what else to add on that front. But they're doing a good job here of like sort of laying the territory out and talking about like what sort of philosophically is at stake between these different positions. This is more error theory focused than I expected, but okay. But there's none of this stuff that gets me all riled up. So we got to get to that. Yeah, Emerson Green is the perfect person for that. Oh, you know what? I think you're right. Maybe we should get in touch with Emerson. For whatever reason, Emerson doesn't seem to like talking to me or doesn't want to talk to me, doesn't really respond to me. So I don't know if it would be valuable for me to get in touch with him. I think Emerson actually seemed upset when I said, wow, there's like such good production on this video. And I really meant that. Sometimes people will say it's like if you're writing a letter recommendation for a student and you write like, oh, they have good handwriting. There's a pragmatic implication that they're not doing well on other things. But that's not at all what I had it like. I really was just genuinely impressed and envious of the super high quality of the sound. It's always so crisp. I just like the videos. I think they're really well produced. They're not overdone. Some people have all these graphics and bullshit, and he doesn't do that. It's just crisp, clear sound, and I like that. And I wish I knew how to pull that off. So, Emerson, if you actually somehow hear this in the middle of this, I really meant that, and not as a pragmatic implication that you're not doing good on other stuff. And also, if you do actually have information on your sound setup and how you produce such good sound quality, I would genuinely like to know. I know a couple people I could ask, and it's always spend more money on this thing or have a different move where you're located, which I can't. I can't. So I'm stuck with it. So, but eventually I'm going to have a place where I can do all this, probably with a better setup. Anyway, yeah, maybe Emerson is a person to reach out to. Jaya says, I'm an audio engineer. Well, that's amazing. So what should I do? So I've got a Blue Yeti. I've got it on a stand here. I don't know where to put this thing. But this room just, I don't think it has good acoustics, and I don't think there's much I could do. I also don't like having a microphone right in my face. That feels and seems really weird. So there's not a lot I could do about that. Do I just need a better microphone? What do I need? Oh, and I messed with it too much, and now it's like falling down. 1 second. I'll readjust it. So I don't like it to be in the camera. It's distracting to me. So if there's a way, some people have the microphone like here and they talk like this, and makes my skin crawl. Can't do that. I don't know what that is. A Rode lapel mic. I have a lapel mic. Do you think that would be better than a Blue Yeti? Yeah, I have. I'll pop one out next. I don't feel like rummaging through the drawer, but I do have a lapel mic. So, but I assumed that wouldn't be as good a quality. Anyway, let's keep going.
There are no such things. Right? So you're right that there is a lot of agreement, at least at the level of characterizing our commitments between the moral error theorist and the robust realist. But then, of course, they end up with strongly opposed views on the resultant claims. So why should we go for with that contrast now? So we're now putting to one side all of these wishy-washy intermediate positions or whatever, right? And we're now thinking about the real strong candidates, robust realism on one side, error theory on the other. Why should we go for robust realism? Okay. So here's one kind of consideration here. I think you will find it close to making moral judgments, or to avoid those parts of social practice that seem to presuppose moral judgments. Just try not to resent someone who wrongs you, ever. Not to blame anyone, to educate your kids without without using moral language, and so on. Now, there is an easy retort for the error theorist, so I want to preempt it. The easy retort is to say, yeah, but I can explain why you would do these things without invoking moral facts. Something about, I don't know, the evolutionary benefits of speaking this way. I actually don't think that works, but maybe something along these lines could work. So I want to note that my point here is not explanatory, and it's not third personal. It's crucial that it's run in the first person. Okay? So my question is not, look at these people who moralize. Can you explain their moralizing without invoking moral facts? I'm willing to give social science and psychology carte blanche that they will succeed in doing so. I don't know that they have already, but I don't care. That's fine. My question is to you in the first person. Don't try to explain why it is that you moralize, even if there are no moral facts. Can you go on without moralizing? Can you go on without moralizing without thinking there's moral facts? I find that to be trivially easy to do. Was he suggesting? Because I make moral judgments all the time, not a problem at all. And I don't believe that there's objective moral facts. In good faith. And do so in good faith? Absolutely. Sure. Be a moral error theorist. Now, I see. Could you be in good faith a moral error theorist? So I should let people finish their sentences before I comment. Let's hear the thing from the start. My question is to you in the first person. Don't try to explain why it is that you moralize, even if there are no moral facts. Can you go on without moralizing? Can you, in good faith, be a moral error theorist? You can. So error theorists have a few options. You could say the kind of arguably bad faith position would be fictionalism. So error theorists deal with this question of conditional not being the case, that ordinary moral language purports to describe stance-independent moral facts, but there are no stance-independent moral facts. For whatever metaphysical reasons one might suppose that there are, that you're stuck with error theory. That's the correct account. Then there's this sort of question of what now? What do you do now?
So one option is to just pretend like, hey, moral language is useful, it's expedient, so I'll pretend, and everybody else can just continue to be in error. And you could call that fictionalism. Well, yeah, why did I say you could call it? That's called fictionalism. It already has a name. So that's one view. You could also be a sort of abolitionist and want to get rid of morality. You could argue for a revisionary view. So you could say, look, I want to continue the practice of morality, but I want to revise what we take moral discourse to be doing. So there's a variety of maybe there's more. I haven't read some of the recent stuff on that sort of what now question, but like those are some options. And so you could think, okay, yeah. So for the narrow theorist, some of them are going to struggle to speak in non-fictional terms and then continue to engage in everyday moral discourse. And I do think something like abolitionism or some type of revisionary view would be challenging, which isn't to say impossible. David Hume Goat, that's the name. Is Richard Joyce a fictionalist? I believe so. Yeah, Coffee Smoke says yes. David Hume says, just asking, no way I'm going to be a fictionalist. With the comma, that's so interesting. No way I'm going to be a fictionalist. Without the comma, it sounds like no way I'm going to be a fictionalist, like I wouldn't be one. But if there's a comma, no way I'm going to be a fictionalist, or just that shift in that little pause and the shift in tone, they meet the opposite, which is cool. Andrew Moy says, I suspect Enoch is going to be building a lot of things in a good faith that presupposes realism. Well, he hasn't done so yet.
Now, I don't think of this as a conclusive argument, obviously, but I do think that this should give you pause, right? When Harpreet Field puts forward an error theory about numbers, he doesn't just give an argument and stop there. He also shows, or attempts to show, I think the jury's still out on that you can do science without numbers, right? That's the name of his book. Namely, that you can, in good faith, continue to rely on these things without the ontological commitment. Okay, next time someone cuts you off on the road and you resent them, next time you want to punish someone, next time you want to praise someone, next time you feel really proud of something that you've done with a moral aspect to it, next time you feel guilty, fill in all of these details. Tell me how you make all of these things respectable, as it were, without any moral facts. You could just...
How you make them respectable without moral facts? What does he mean by respectable? So I don't think, like, if I eat good food and go, yum, do I need to offer a respect? Like, what does he mean by respectable? Like, do I have to offer like a causal explanation for why I would be disposed to do that? So this might be a problem for an error theorist who thinks, oh, everything I'm doing is radically in error, and yet they keep doing it anyway. That might be an issue. But I don't take that to be a reason to accept moral realism. I take it to be a reason to reconsider whether the realist account of ordinary moral language is correct in the first place. And it's not that difficult for a person to just opt into employing these practices in a proprietary way. So, if it's embedded in our social institutions, like okay, I'll give a really weird one. Now imagine prudential considerations they all implicitly presupposed a plan from God. So you live in a society where everybody's a theist and everybody thinks God has planned out what you should or shouldn't do in every situation when it comes to like practical questions, what you should eat, how you should dress, all that stuff. And so it's just an embedded feature of the language that in prudential context, in other words, like practical, everyday, self-regarding context about what you should or shouldn't do. Should I take that job? Should I go for a walk? Should I eat healthy food? In all of those cases, people think God has planned out the course of your life. You have a fate. And there are facts about what would be prudent, what wouldn't be prudent. And what that means is it's in accord with God's will or it's not in accord with God's will. So now you could have a kind of divine prudential error theory in the context of that society. In that society, prudential normative claims presuppose God's will, but God doesn't exist, you might come to believe if you become an atheist. And so you don't actually think any of these claims presuppose God's will. What do you do at that point? Do you just go, well, I guess there's just no way to make sense of like, I shouldn't, walk off the edge of a cliff, or I shouldn't touch a hot stove and burn myself for no good reason? No, I think at that point you would say, okay, well, that's what everybody else is doing, but that's not what I'm doing. Now that I realize, or now I believe at least, that there is no God, or at least there isn't a God that wills all of the prudential normative facts on behalf of my life. My life isn't fated or planned out. I'm doing something else when I talk about prudential considerations. What I'm doing is trying to figure out what serves my interests, something like that. And so now I have a proprietary revisionary account where I recognize when other people say, hey, no, I'm not going to go to the party. I'm going to get some sleep. It's the prudential thing to do. What they mean is that's what God wants them to do, or that's God's will. But when I say, hey, I'm going to skip that party and go take a nap, I'm saying it serves my interest, or it would be good for me in the long term. Is there something like you that's not respectable about that? Why can't you do that? I think the answer is you just can do that. And I don't think that this would create any massive problems in your interactions with others. You could go about thinking this way, and that technically being what you mean by what you say, without anybody even noticing. Now there might be a context where people get really philosophical or reflective, and they press you into a corner and they say, look, I understand that it serves your interest, but does God will it? And they think that there might be a split between the two. And then you might go, well, when I say it's a prudential thing to do, I mean it's good for me. I don't think that God is willing anything. And then might go, oh, wait, whoa, you mean something totally different. So there are circumstances where backed into a corner that might occur, but the everyday practice would continue to be functional, useful, do the job it's intended to do, and it wouldn't cause any problems. I don't see why an error theorist couldn't just adopt a personal proprietary revisionary account of what they're doing with the moral discourse and just not take themselves to be doing what other people are doing, and they would navigate the world perfectly fine. And it's unclear why that wouldn't be respectable. But I don't know what he means by that, so it's hard to critique the view. Sapir says, is he saying that because the host said he's trying to decide between robust realism and error theory? Yeah, maybe. So it might be that error theorists are saddling themselves with certain sorts of, you could say, like dialectical problems or deliberative or practical problems in virtue of their commitment to like part of realism. You said it might be an issue for error theorists. Yeah, it might be an issue for error theorists. It's really going to depend on, it's not really my goal here to try to defend or vindicate some sort of account of error theory. I'm not very sympathetic to error theory. I mean, I could try, and I guess I'm kind of sort of doing that. But it's not something I'm going to lean too much into, because I just think you should just reject error theory. What if the guy's choosing between those two? It might look like more like a reason to accept realism. I don't know what the reason is, because it's unclear what he means by respectable. Cult of Scriabin says, my position of metaethics is that I think agents use moral language in different ways. Some refer to objective facts, some refer to subjective facts. What does that make me? So I actually referenced Gill a couple times here already. Michael Gill has this great paper back from 2009 called Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. And what he does in that paper is he says, look, all these disputes about what people mean when they make moral claims, the semantics of ordinary discourse, have seemed intractable. And so here's a couple proposals for what might be going on. So first he says, it looks like if you look at the sort of course of 20th century metaethics, what philosophers took themselves to be doing is they would take some pocket of discourse that best fit a realist analysis or an anti-realist analysis. Like you look at a portion of language, oh, look at this. A person is presenting a moral argument that really seems to fit cognitivism better than non-cognitivism. Okay, but look at this person expressing that's just wrong with a sense of outrage. That really seems to fit a kind of a motivist or non-cognitivist position better. And then as Gill frames this, what they do is, so they'll start with those pockets that are consistent with their account, that really look like they fit it. Paradigmatic instances of prototypical moral language that comport better with the cognitivist, non-cognitivism, realism, or anti-realism, whatever. And then what they try to do is explain away the others as parasitic or non-central or less primary on these central uses. So the realist starts with the realist looking talk and then says, yeah, there's talk over here, but that's like parasitic. It's like we could explain it away. And then the other side does the same thing. And he says, what seems to be going on here is a presumption that ordinary moral language is uniform and determinate enough that one or the other of these accounts is actually better than the others. So he calls this the uniformity determinacy assumption. And then he says, what if that assumption is wrong? What if ordinary moral discourse is not uniform or not determinate or both? And he proposes two alternative hypotheses, each which respectively corresponds to uniformity and determinacy. The opposite, or the sort of contrast to uniformity, would be variability. He calls it metaethical variability. And that would be the view that some moral language is used in a way that best fits one analysis, and some moral language is used in a way that best fits another. And so you could have both interpersonal and intrapersonal variability. Interpersonal variability would be one person speaks like a realist, one person speaks like an anti-realist. One speaks like a cognitivist, one speaks like a non-cognitivist. Intrapersonal variability, or within person variability, would be that in some context or with respect to some moral issues, I express cognitivism or realism, and then with respect to other issues, I express some non-cognitivist or anti-realist view. And you might say that a person that is a pluralist is also technically a realist, although I guess they could be an error theorist subjectivist. So there, some moral language they think doesn't purport to describe stance-independent moral facts, and some of it does. The stuff that does is subject to an error theory. The stuff that doesn't would be like relativistic or something like that. So then you could call them a pluralist anti-realist. So you could have pluralist, realist, pluralist, anti-realist. So why did I start using the term pluralist instead of variablist? Well, so Gill uses the term variability, but in subsequent research where this started to get more into experimental philosophy, the most relevant paper, I think, the one that probably set the stage for this, was a paper by Jennifer Wright. So it's Wright, Grangian, and McWhite from 2013. And that paper is a response to a 2008 paper from Goodwin and Darley. I think that's called The Psychology of Metaethics, Exploring Objectivism, something like that. And what Wright and co-authors did in that paper is they said, okay, well, Goodwin and Darley's paper actually found that across, when you give people different moral issues, they seem to give an objectivist or realist response for some of them and an anti-realist response for the others. So it looks like variability, but they call it pluralism. And pluralism in this case would be, I think most of the emphasis here is on intra or within person variability, a person giving a realist response to some things and an anti-realist response to others. And what they propose in that paper is, hey, maybe what's going on here is that there's systematic variation in what participants themselves consider to be moral issues, because the researchers just throw a big pile of issues at the participants and just categorize them a priori, like from the armchair. The researchers are like, yeah, these are what we consider to be the moral issues. And so then the people give the realist or anti-realist responses to that big old pile of issues. Now, what if the participants themselves say, look, I don't consider this issue to be a moral issue, but I do consider this one to be a moral issue. And then once you factor in what the participants themselves consider moral and non-moral issues, now you could look at, okay, of those issues participants themselves consider moral, do they take a realist or anti-realist stance? And what they hypothesize is that once you take into consideration the participants' own categorization of the norms, then participants, I think they do predict this, and then they get findings contrary to the prediction, that you're going to do away with most of the apparent variability or pluralism. But they didn't find that. They found that even when you accounted for the participants' own categorization, they still took a realist stance towards some moral issues, or at least gave a realist response towards some moral issues and an anti-realist response towards others. I use that caveat because I don't actually think these are valid measures in the first place. I don't think these people are realists or anti-realists about those issues. I think they're not interpreting the questions as intended. But that paper sort of kickstarted this recognition that the other people probably noticed before this, but subsequent studies find the same sort of thing, which is that participants tend to give realist responses to some questions and anti-realist responses to others. This was originally called metaethical variability. Now it seems to have shifted towards being called metaethical pluralism. So the answer to your question is metaethical pluralism, or metaethical pluralist. That's a super long answer to that question, but you touched on what I wrote my dissertation on. So I defend, you could say, the other horn. It's not really a dilemma, but the other horn of that two-pronged proposal. I defend indeterminacy with a technically, and it's in the dissertation, a splash of this pluralism in there. So I do think people sometimes have determinate positions, but by and large, they just don't. Okay, that was quite a response. All right. And Coffee Smug says, I hold a similar view. Hell yeah. All right. Shagad Guru says, agents, why not simply type humans? Could say humans. Agent is, because like technically you might not think that certain like babies have positions on these matters, or like a person in a perpetual coma. Maybe they did have a position on the matter. And you might think that aliens could have issues on these things. So maybe saying humans isn't quite as accurate as just saying agents. All right.
Just decide that they're not respected. You can say that's all. That's like feeling angry at the table when I bump my knee against the table's leg. Right? Yeah, I feel angry at the table, but I know it's bullshit. I don't, as it were, reflectively stand behind my feeling of anger towards the table because I know it's just an inanimate object. Can you, in good faith, think precisely along these lines about all of your moral emotions, all of your participation in social moral practices, and so on? Now, I'm not even saying that you can't. What I am saying is that's not going to be easy. It's a huge price to pay. So at the very least, the burden of proof is on the error theorist. And now we need to, look through the arguments and see how convincing are the moral error theorists' positive arguments for their error theory, or the negative arguments against realism, and so on. I think it's going to be a kind of a general holistic evaluation of plausibility of different ways to go. But I really think that, as with every theory, you should start with a clear and honest appreciation of just how intuitive or counterintuitive it is. Seriously going error theoretic on morality is unbelievably counterintuitive. The arguments would have to be shockingly strong to justify anything like this. And to get back to the point we started with, if you now think that, furthermore, we should go error theoretic on the normative, not just on the moral, then things are going to be harder still. So now you're going to have to say something about why it's not a good idea to form beliefs in wishful thinking, why it's much better to form them by inference, the best explanation, say. You're going to have to do this without invoking any normative language or anything like a normative fact. You would have to support your own error theory without talking of supporting, because supporting seems like a normative relation. Again, I'm not seriously arguing the self-defeat point here. It would need more details. What I am saying is the costs are unbelievably high. If you want to go down that route, you need arguments that are,
What are these costs? He's not explaining what the costs are. He also says it's like extremely counterintuitive. I really don't like that phrasing. Counterintuitive to who? Who is it counterintuitive to? Philosophers just say things are intuitive or counterintuitive as if there's a fact of the matter about whether something is intuitive or isn't intuitive, independent of whether it's intuitive or counterintuitive to anyone in particular, any particular group or people or whatever. What the hell is he talking about? Like when he says this, I don't know why I didn't have to phrase it that antagonistically. I'm sorry, David. But sorry, I had to grab some socks because my feet are freezing. It's super cold here. So yeah, because I realized I waved it into the camera and you're like, what the hell? What the hell is that? It's counterintuitive to him. That's fine. It's nothing about this strikes me as particularly counterintuitive. Now, if the claim is an error theorist is stuck speaking and thinking in ways that seem at odds with what? With the way that they find themselves disposed to speak? Well, moral language can do more than, it could walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. It could do more than one thing. So moral language, it may turn out that it presupposes, like it's used by people to presuppose certain sorts of metaphysical facts that the error theorist thinks don't exist. And so it's in a certain sense committed to something that's false. Okay, but is that all moral language is doing? Or is all we use moral language for to go around reporting what these is all the moral language, is all we're doing just reporting what these metaphysical facts are? Do you use moral language to just go, hey, by the way, murder is wrong. By the way, stealing is wrong. And it stands independently wrong. No, moral language serves practical purposes as well. And the fact that the metaphysical commitments might drop away or be misguided doesn't mean that it doesn't have those practical components as well. So say you're an error theorist. It's true that you might think it's true that it is not the case that technically speaking, it's morally wrong for another person to punch you in the face and steal your money. Okay, so if you're confronted with someone and they punch you in the face and steal your money, and then you're going to go report them to the police, would you go, like, would you be committed to going, well, I don't technically think what they did is wrong, and then the police go, oh, well, then you have no reason to press charges? Why? Because the moral language, it's not just used to say what the person did is wrong, and by that I mean objectively or stance independently wrong. It's also something you don't want them to do, the police don't want them to do, most people don't want them to do. You would want them to be punished for it. The police would want them to be punished for it. Most other people would want them to be punished for it. So you want certain sorts of things, and the people around you generally want those same things. Why wouldn't that be the reason why you would say, yeah, I want to press charges, right? So I wouldn't want to just press charges because their actions were stance independently wrong. I'd want to press charges because I want to deter that kind of behavior, because I want that feeling of getting justice, because I want to deter that and disincentivize that in other people. Maybe if you're like super compassionate because you think that that's a good way for that person to have an opportunity to reform or rehabilitate themselves. There's all sorts of motivations that coincide with our ordinary moral practices that would continue to persist even if one recognizes that the metaphysical presuppositions behind that discourse are mistaken. And so why do you have to borrow a very trite phrase, throw all that bathwater with the baby? Just rejecting the baby doesn't mean that you don't get any of the bathwater. There's a lot of bathwater that an error theorist is going to want. And I don't see why it's got to be all or nothing. So I don't see any problem with an error theorist going, but there's so many other reasons to use the moral language that people happen to be using, even if they're making a big mistake with it in one particular respect. So I just don't really see an issue here. And I don't see why they're paying a massive cost. What's the cost? The cost is to continue speaking in a way when you realize other people are full of shit. I think people are full of shit about all kinds of stuff. I'm just not seeing what the issue is. I'm not an error theorist, so maybe there is an issue, but it seems like a pretty trivial one. All right. There's some more comments here. Jagat says, coffee smug. Oh, responding to somebody else. By indeterminacy, do you mean too many possible circumstances surrounding each discrete moral act? Well, that's not what I mean. So indeterminacy is a view about the meaning of ordinary moral claims, which holds that neither one or another of competing analyses with respect to a particular metaethical dispute offers a better account of the meaning of those moral claims. So you could say it's like underdetermined, or maybe there's no fact of the matter at all. Andrew Moy says, I forgot how weird Enoch's views were. Yeah, it depends what you mean by weird, because I think a lot of non-naturalist realists are going to think the same way. So from a purely perspective of judging things as weird or not based on how conventional they are, I have much weirder views than Enoch. Giles says his assertions on error theory are purely emotional. I'm not sure about that. Just because, something I was just saying about moral language is that it having an emotional component to it doesn't mean that it doesn't also have this like belief reporting component. You might want to retain the emotional component even if you get rid of the belief reporting component. Same thing here. He could be emotional or passionate about his views and very much that not be the driving factor. He could think, no, error theorists are wrong, and also it riles me up that they're wrong. No inconsistency there. So I don't think he's just arguing out of pure emotion. He could be, but I don't see any particularly good reason to think that. All right. So it just said they emailed David. Uh-oh. I hope I'm not getting professors to be bothered because of my streams.
So much stronger than the ones we've been given so far by error theorists.
Is this just a pragmatic argument for robust moral realism? By which I mean, is this argument really just saying that if we reject the contention that our moral claims are true, if we reject that, life becomes really hard to live consistently. And so in that sense, there's a huge cost. Religion claims to navigate life, and maybe it's even psychologically impossible to avoid doing so. And so you're caught in a deep inconsistency in the way you conduct your life. I mean, that does just strike me as pragmatic considerations that have no necessary or even likely connection to the truth. They just seem orthogonal to concerns that might latch on to what's true. These are just saying life gets hard. Maybe I'm wrong there, but Is this a more pragmatic argument?
No, it's a natural word to have, but that's not how I think of it. Here's the way of thinking about it that is perhaps a little bit less amenable to this way of understanding it. God rarely whispers things on our ear, right? So we're down here with all sorts of evidence, things that we believe, things that seem more and less plausible to us, and we're just trying to do our best. What this means, among other things, is that whenever a theory leads to counterintuitive results, it loses some points. That doesn't mean that whenever a theory leads to a counterintuitive implication, it means that it's false or refuted, because it may still earn points elsewhere. Maybe it succeeds in explaining a lot of stuff. Maybe it's a beautiful theory. Maybe it's ontologically parsimonious, right? There are lists of theoretical virtues. Those lists too, of course, are controversial because everything interesting is, but yes, something along these lines. What I highlighted or tried to highlight earlier is precisely the thought that going error theoretic leads to tremendously counterintuitive implications. The counterintuitive implications are not how hard it is for you to stop blaming people. The counterintuitive implication is that it's always wrong to blame people. Or I don't know about wrong, because it's always
that's not. I think he has to rephrase that.
a mistake. Or anyway, blaming people. The counterintuitive implication is that it's always wrong to blame people. Or I don't know about wrong, because it's always a mistake. Or anyway, any statement of the form someone's blameworthy for something is false, or anyway not true.
Yeah, so it would be true that as an error theorist, you're going to take statements like that person ought to be punished, insofar as you view that as a moral claim. That statement is false, right? But that doesn't mean that you think it's a mistake in the practical sense. So what I mean by that is that even if you think that the statement is false, it doesn't mean you think it's like it's a bad idea to punish people, or that it's not useful to punish people. And so it wouldn't be a mistake in the sense that, like, hey, it would be a mistake if I went out to the mailbox and I tripped and fell down. Like I made a mistake in terms of my walking because something that I did interfered with my goals. In this case, if you want to punish people because there's practical benefits to doing so, you're not making a mistake with respect to your goals. It's just that if you were to construe moral claims of a certain kind, like if you were to express them as a proposition, the proposition would technically be false. That's all the error theorist is committed to, not some sort of practical inability to act on one's moral values.
And similarly, for the thought that it's wrong to humiliate people, and similarly, all of these are highly, I mean, the way I picture it is that all of these intuitive propositions, they come with price tags. The price is, and the currency is plausibility points.
Yeah, and then there's just going to be a question of how do we determine whether something is paying a cost or is a benefit, and how do we make these judgments about plausibility? Because what David thinks is plausible or not is going to differ radically from what I think is plausible or not. I think his conception of non-naturalist moral realism is, and I mean this without exaggeration, one of the least plausible positions anyone could have about anything. I really mean that. I'm just describing my point of view. So I can at least imagine there being some absolutely bizarro conspiracy, and then it turns out the earth is flat, something like that. I could imagine someone somewhere discovering Bigfoot. And I find those to be just preposterous positions. Well, flat earth is preposterous. Bigfoot is like super implausible, but maybe not preposterous. Maybe it is. But moral realism stands in a category of its own. I think it's less plausible than theism. I think it's less plausible than alien abductions being real. I think it's less plausible than the Loch Ness Monster existing. I find it to be one of the least plausible positions. It's so implausible to me that I am perpetually just amazed that anybody takes the position seriously. Now that's where I'm coming at this from. And so when I am looking at price tags, any argument that results in a non-naturalist moral realism is true carries the biggest price tag I could imagine a philosophical position taking. It might not be an exaggeration to say that I think like dialetheism, like just straight up accepting contradictions or accepting really bizarre forms of logic would be more viable. I can't think of too many things that are less plausible. So if we're doing plausibility judgments here, whose stance on plausibility are we using? Like, my priors are just going to be very different from David's. That isn't even to say that I should, like, I'm just describing my psychology here. That's how I react to these things. They just strike me as totally bananas. I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong about the position. I don't think I'm wrong about how implausible I find it. So like, okay, so different people have different reactions to these things. I don't think there's an objective fact about how plausible these things are. So I don't know how, like, if plausibility points are how we adjudicate these things, then are we going to be like radical subjectivists about which philosophical position comes out on top? Like, what are we doing here if this is how we're approaching things?
Well, other things being equal, if you have two theories, one entails that it is wrong to humiliate people, and one entails that that sentence is false or perhaps just not true. Well, that's a few plausibility points for the former kind of view.
No, it's not. I don't think so. Why? Why is that more plausibility points? Because if what it means to say it's wrong to, what did he say, humiliate people, if what that means is there are non-natural facts according to which one has irreducibly normative object given external reasons, what I'm throwing all the terminology. If there are these stance independent moral facts which give one a reason, an external reason to not humiliate people independent of one's goals or standards, that's precisely what I find super implausible. So if that's what that means, then I think, yeah, there are no facts of that kind to not only be plausible, to be like super obviously the more plausible. So how are we adjudicating plausibility points here? The first of those is radically implausible. The second one isn't. I think a lot of what's going on here is something like normative entanglement. So you look at these positions, it's wrong to humiliate people. Is that statement, well, true or false? Someone could just have a different normative view without being an error theorist, because the error theorist is going to think that statement is false, and then every other statement saying it's wrong to humiliate people, that's false. But then also it's good to humiliate people, that's also false. So the error theorist is going to think all of those statements are false. But you know, if you're looking at this and you're trying to judge between the two, part of what I think is happening is that it sounds bad to say it's false that humiliating people is wrong, because I think it carries pragmatic implications about the disposition or attitude of the person that would say that. Now, a person could say something like this. They could say, technically speaking, because to say that it's wrong to humiliate people is to make a robust claim about non-natural moral properties. I don't think there are any of those, so I think such claims are false, but I'm very opposed to humiliating people, and I would act to prevent it. I wouldn't do it myself, blah, blah, blah. Does that sound super implausible to you? Because that is what an error theorist is committed to. An error theorist, all an error theorist is committed to is the first part of that, but the error theorist probably thinks the other stuff. So that is what an error theorist is actually saying. They're saying, yeah, I don't think there's these robust non-natural moral facts according to which whether an action is right or wrong depends on the existence of these moral properties. And so when it comes to the statement that it's wrong to humiliate people, I don't think there's properties that our moral claims are correctly referring to when people make those claims, but I'm against humiliation and I really am blah, blah, blah. What's so implausible about that? So I think that the appearance of plausibility is kind of, it kind of derives its value from being sort of playing on the pragmatic associations we would have with making that remark in an ordinary context. And that's what that's what I call normative entanglement. So that's what I think is really going on here. So I don't think he's shown that there's any extra plausibility points for realism in this case.
It's not conclusive. We're going to go for a kind of holistic evaluation of theories, of competing theories, but it's definitely a price tag. And
yeah, he says it's definitely a price tag. David, I don't agree with you. I don't think there's a price tag to pay here. I think realism is paying the price tag here. I just contradicted myself. I don't think there's a price tag here. If I were committed to there being price tags about things, I would favor the anti-realist view here and think that realism is paying the price tag. But I think that I don't like this framing in price tags. So I don't think there's an objective fact about which position has more of a price tag or not. So that's a better way of phrasing it. I think either it's going to be subjective or like highly contingent on our individual psychology, or it's best just not to construe things in these terms at all.
Similarly for many, many other things. And if you go metanormative, then you get an even wider set of propositions with rather hefty price tags that you're going to have to reject. Thus understood, the difficulty is theoretical. It's about how the theory leads to highly counterintuitive results across,
he just hasn't shown. It's unclear what he means by counterintuitive here. Counterintuitive to him or to me or to people in general. What does he mean by that? It's not counterintuitive to me.
different areas and so on. And it's hard for me to see that it gives us enough plausibility points elsewhere to justify the bargain.
So it seems to me like
I just don't think this is a good method for approaching these.
this is what Matt Lutz calls the now what objection to moral error theory. That, okay, we've come to conclude.
No, I don't think
You
that's
what?
right. I think it's a different objection.
Okay. Well, let me articulate, rattle off what I was going to say, and then tell me how to think through this. Where he says, once we've come to think that there are no moral facts, our moral claims are all false. Like, now what? What do we do? And insofar as I understand what he then says, it's that we can still continue to live our lives exactly the same, because we have these strong preferences, and it makes sense that we would just live in accord with them. So Matt says repeatedly, like, I have a strong distaste for murder. I really don't like that. And I don't like a world where that happens. And so I'm going to act in accord with that preference. And, there's nothing I can do to get rid of that preference. And so it makes sense to just act in accord with it. It would be like if you had a pathological aversion to vanilla ice cream. Well, if you did, then you would just avoid vanilla ice cream. And it wouldn't matter to you if you were told, well, there's no objective facts about what flavor of ice cream is best. You would still have your preference and act in accord with it, I think, is the gist of his response. And so maybe what he would say here is, given all of that, it still makes sense to teach your children moral principles and to feel resentment when somebody harms you and so on and so forth, because these just are your kind of inbuilt preferences. And see, in some sense of rational, which I know itself is a normative claim, seems rational to follow your preferences. So there you go. There's a family of related responses.
Yeah. So as I said, I think it's a somewhat different objection. The line of thought that I try to develop has nothing to do with the question, what will you do now? I mean, maybe the way I put it invited that understanding, but it's not about how will we survive now that we've come to see the light and the truth of the moral error theory. I'm actually not a fan of that objection. I don't find what you said in reply to it very convincing, and I'll say something about it in a second. But in general, roughly because of your own distinction from earlier on between pragmatic and theoretical considerations, the mere fact that it's not clear how to proceed does not mean that the theory is necessarily false, or even that it's one that we should reject, I think. But my objection was different. My objection was just about what are the intuitive judgments that follow, and what are the judgments that follow, how intuitive or counterintuitive are they, and so how are we doing in terms of tallying plausibility points?
I would like to know from David what happens if you give a case to two people that are well informed on the topic, like they would consider themselves epistemic peers. I don't know if he would consider me like an epistemic peer. You think that there's something defective about my way of thinking, but I look at the scenario and I go, yeah, I consider the realist response here implausible, and the anti-realist one more plausible, and then he has the opposite response. How do we resolve that? In other words, once it becomes a matter of plausibility points, what if we disagree on how plausible positions are? Is there a method for adjudicating that difference?
Your theory entails that if your theory entails that there are only 3 minds in the universe, that counts against your theory. It's not a conclusive argument against your theory, because I still have to see its advantages, and I have to see the advantages and disadvantages, the theoretical advantages and disadvantages of.
Yeah, see, this doesn't make much sense to me. How does that count against your theory? It would be contingent on a bunch of background facts. What if you say there's only 3 minds in the universe, and I have mountains and mountains and mountains of empirical evidence showing that I and my 2 friends created this universe and then put ourselves into it as characters, and the rest of you are NPCs. Here's all the evidence for that. And then they actually have a bunch of evidence for it. Okay, well, now the evidence is in favor of that view. So I don't see how that would count against it. It's not like the universe only has 3 people in it is just automatically less plausible than it having more people in it, for instance, or fewer. Maybe that just only God exists or something, or you're a solipsist, you think only one person exists. It sounds absurd, but it sounds absurd that there's only 3 minds in the universe, conditional on you holding a bunch of background beliefs according to which that would in fact be absurd, which I do. It's obviously absurd, right? It's clearly true that the universe has, it's not the case that the universe only has 3 minds in it. But if you give me a bunch of information suggesting that it was the case, I would change my view. And I would think, yep, now that's the more plausible. So how plausible something is can only be judged against the backdrop of the rest of your beliefs or commitments. And since the rest of your beliefs and commitments are going to vary from one person to another, I don't see how there could possibly be some sort of view from nowhere from which you could judge different positions to be more or less plausible, independent of any particular point of view, which is, it might be what he's hinting at here. And I don't even think that's possible at all. I don't even know what that would look like in principle.
Competing theories. But let's just put it this way. Universe, there's a pretty serious burden of proof on you.
Yeah, so the stuff about burden of proof. So I totally get the first part of that. If you want to convince me that there's only 3 minds in the universe, you're going to need to do a lot of work. I agree with him about that. But then if I say, so the burden of proof is on you, is it like a relative burden of proof? Like relative to my point of view, you would have to do a lot of work to convince me, because I don't think that this means that I get to like declare victory if the person has that view and they don't immediately present me with evidence. If they have a bunch of private access to different information than me, where they have good reason, like just imagine this position. So 3 friends create this universe as a video game, right? So they create this universe, and they know that we're all NPCs in the universe. We're not real people, right? So those 3 friends create the universe, and then so they're sitting there with their 2 friends, right? And they're like, all right, I'm going to put on the VR headset. Y'all ready? You ready? Cool. All right. And they know there's nobody else in the room. It's 3 friends that live in an isolated area. No one knows about the project that they're working on to create like this universe with like this Earth world with these like weird ape creatures. Like, look at the hands. What the hell is that? Like they got tentacles, right? So they're just like, look at these hands. Oh, so weird. Ooh, creepy, right? So we're just these weird things, right? So, and nobody knows they're doing this. So the 3 of them pop on their headsets, and now like one of them is me, right? So I'm one of them. Lance is one of them. And then I know who the other 2 are, and we could like DM each other, and like it's almost like telepathic communication. It's like 2 other people on Earth right now, and I'm just talking to them. Like this could be true. And I'm talking to them right now. So we know we're the only 3 people. And so now you tell me the burden of proof is on you. Is it? Because like I know you don't exist. Like David Enoch is like an NPC or something, or he could be one of the 3, and maybe he and I both know, and he's tricking everybody. It's not true, but it totally would depend on the point of view that you have, and so you could totally be interacting in this world from the point of view from which it's completely obvious to you that there's only 3 minds. So and it wasn't even that hard for me to come up with a scenario like that. So whether or not the burden of proof is on somebody is contingent on what that person's personal informational, like their information content is like. And that's going to vary from one person to another.
Argument on you. You have to give very convincing arguments to that effect. Otherwise, I'm sticking to the thought that there are either many, many more or perhaps somewhat less minds in the universe, but certainly not 3. It's the same kind of logic, right? So, well, if you have one theory or family of theories according to which it's wrong to humiliate people, that sentence ends up being true. And then there are other theories on which that sentence ends up being false. Other things being equal, go for the first.
Yeah. Why though? Why? What's the reason? Why is that more plausible? Yeah, I don't know why he thinks that.
And similarly for many other things. Pain is bad. Wishful thinking is not the best way of forming beliefs, etc., etc. The fact that error theorists have developed the kind of palate that allows them to enjoy biting bullets, while psychologically.
Yeah, see this talk of biting bullets. What bullet are they biting? All of this framing seems to just privilege the realist point of view, as though there's just something inherently better about it. And he hasn't done anything to show that it is. Maybe he does in his work somewhere, but I'm not seeing it here. So I'd want to know what that looks like. All right. So it looks like we've got to the good stuff, but there's no way I could do a 3-hour stream on this these days. Too much other stuff going on. So I'm going to call it quits there. Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you everybody in the stream. So do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that already, leave a comment, help, get me pushed up in the algorithm. This is a small channel. It's been tough for me to get a lot of recognition and notice because of how slow the growth in this channel has been. I think streaming is probably hurting me. Instead of doing recorded videos, they seem to get a lot more views. I did a couple recently and they got way more views than the streams. It puts all the streams outside of the recorded video section, and so it makes it hard to search, makes it hard to find. Really dumb. YouTube, fix that. This should just go in the recorded video section. This should just be one section for all your videos. So I don't like that. Because I guess it's not worth getting into. But so yeah, like stuff. Please leave a comment, even if it's a critical comment. Share the video, talk about it. And I did link this video in the description, especially if you want to go finish off the video. I don't know when I'm going to get back to doing a second part and continuing it, hopefully soon, but who knows? Life is a little hectic. So but if you do leave a comment over there, I'm going to pop into the comment section. In fact, for this video, I was thinking of reviewing some of the comments, which would be cool. I haven't done that before, is actually go through the comment section. If you do leave a comment over there, please be polite. Don't be a jerk. And with that, I will catch you all later. Thanks everybody for being here and take care. See y'all.